In the first part of this video series, I showed you how to mix the substrate to go into this aquarium. Now let's take a look at how I put that into the tank and put a cap of sand over the top. So here's my 75-gallon aquarium that I'm going to set up first. Nothing really going on in this tank because the soil substrate is the first thing to go in. One thing I'll warn you about, if your substrate is as dry as mine is, don't just dump it in or you're going to end up with this big cloud of dust that's going to go all over the room. So I'm actually going to put this bin down in there and very gently pour it into the tank. And it's still going to push some dust up into the air. Alright, now our soil's in the tank, we can spread it out a little bit. So I have this nice handy tool for spreading dirt out. I will have some contours in this aquarium, and I want there to be a mound that is higher than the rest of the tank back here in this corner. So I'm going to push this up a little bit back here and spread the rest of it back down this way. Now the other plan for this aquarium is that the whole thing is not going to be planted all the way around. So I'm actually going to pull the dirt away from the front glass because I'm going to have a layer of sand with no plants on it, so I don't need the substrate below it. And then I'm going to continue to pull this contour back towards the end of the aquarium where you're watching this from and slope it down back here into this corner. Now this is pretty thick soil over here on this end, but the roots of the plants will fill that up pretty well. But what I really want is that contour shape so that I have a higher area in the back than I have in the front. And it's simply easier to do that with the substrate, the undercap substrate, the soil substrate, than it is to do it with the cap. So I put a light over the tank so you can get a better idea of what that soil substrate looks like in the tank before I put a cap on it. Now, I'm going to cap this with sand. And here's the sand I'm going to use. This is red flint sand, and it's very, very fine. I've actually never used a sand this fine to cap a substrate tank with, but I am told that it really isn't a problem, so we're going to give it a shot. The cap that goes over the soil substrate is very important. That is the cap that's going to keep all the nutrients down in the root zone and keep them from getting up into the water column where they'll cause a real algae problem. So the thickness of the cap is also very important. I want a cap that is at least 1.5 to 2 inches thick over top of the soil. So when we're done, this is going to look like a big, huge mound of soil in the middle of the tank. But if I use too thin of a cap, then over a couple of years, that sand may push down and a lot of that soil may come up out into the water column. You also want to think about the fish you're going to keep. You may not want to keep any fish that are going to dig too deeply down through the cap. Really, for this type of tank, plants are what it's all about, not so much the fish. So the way I'm going to start is I'm going to start by just using my scoop and very carefully pouring the sand in over the substrate. I'm going to do this slowly and in layers, so it's going to take a little bit of a while. I'm starting with 50 pounds of sand, but when it's all said and done, I will probably have close to 100 pounds of sand inside this aquarium. If you'll notice, I am really concentrating on putting the cap over the soil. I'm not putting a whole lot of sand on the bare glass in front of the soil. I want to make sure I get my 2 inches of sand where I need it first. So right now, there's about a ½ inch of sand over the top of the soil substrate. So before I go any further, I want to add some of my structural hardscaping pieces into the tank, so when I put the rest of the cap on, it'll make them look like they were naturally buried. This aquarium is going to be a rockscape. And I've got some nice pieces of dark basalty granite that I'm going to put in there. I'm going to use some rocks to brace up this larger one a little bit. I am not going to claim to be the greatest aquascaper in the world, but I think it'll look okay. Now that I have the rocks in there, I can start putting in the rest of the sand, and those rocks will end up being a little more buried. Now I'm going to go ahead and get some of that sand onto that front area of the tank where there's no soil. Hopefully with this shot you can see how thick the sand is over top of the soil substrate. Here's the soil, here's the sand. And it looks pretty good right here, but then it slopes down and it's not as thick there. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to build the sand up quite a bit out here and bring it down so that the sand is thick enough over top of the soil at this point. And one thing I have to be careful to do is carry that thickness all the way across the front of the mound. I want it to be thick all the way across. Now while the sand is dry, it's going to have a tendency to drift and slide down that slope. But once it's wet and once there's plants in it, it's not going to move nearly as easily. So here is the contoured bottom aquarium with all the sand in place. You should notice that I've added quite a bit of sand towards the front of that slope so that the sand's not going to drift down once the water is in. And even though it is not as contoured as it looked when I first put the soil substrate in, it still has a definite slope from front to back. And it also has a gentle slope from right to left. So this tank is now ready for planting. I'm still waiting on the plants. So as soon as they get in here, I will show you how I add water to the aquarium and start the process of getting the plants going in it.